This is a brief-ish video on your upcoming literature review presentation for the dissertation module. Now, the aim of this video is to give you an overview as to the general structure of your work and how it's going to be laid out. Some key do's and don'ts and a bit of information on how your PowerPoint slides should or could be presented. So we'll go from beginning to end. I will try and be as concise as possible. The important thing to bear in mind as we move forward is that what I describe here is not a fixed design necessarily. You don't have to do exactly as I do word for word. For example, I wouldn't recommend using a bog standard black and white PowerPoint slide theme. If nothing else, it's going to be a bit dull for those assessing you, but at the same time, I wouldn't recommend having some multicolored, multi-animation slide that you use somewhere in between. So you can inject a little bit of creativity and originality into your work. This is just to give you an idea of the basics, the foundation of what your presentation needs to include. And crucially, I will mention this again at the end of this video, but it's important that making your slides and preparing your slides should not form the bulk of your preparation for this assessment. It should very much be you doing your wider reading and actually preparing your presentation in terms of rehearsing and practicing multiple times. You shouldn't just expect to, well, I've done this glorious PowerPoint presentation and now I'm just going to do well, having not prepared or rehearsed even once. That wouldn't be an advisable way to proceed. So something to bear in mind. Excuse me. So the very first slide then will be your title. This would just be the same title that you would put at the top of your report. It doesn't matter if it changes between the time you do your literature review presentation and the time you actually submit your report. But they should be roughly the same. You can put your name and the date on there, that doesn't really matter. But don't skip this slide, don't just put it up there for half a second and then move straight on. Read your title out, because not everyone who's going to be assessing you will know what it is that you're doing. So you need to acknowledge what you're doing straight away by reading your title and letting the audience know this is what you're about to hear about. Otherwise you just jump straight in without any context. So moving on to the next slide then, he says, your introductory slides. Now, it's important that you understand the difference between an introduction and a literature review and how the literature review forms part of your introduction section. Your introduction is what will be written in your report, and your literature review is what you will present here. But at the same time, it's hard to talk about a topic without introducing it. And it's even more important, as I said earlier, because some people assessing you won't know what it is you're doing. So you need to clue everyone up to the key themes of your study, what you actually did, what the main components are. So dedicate a slide or two maximum, no more than two, ideally one. Don't spend long on this, just a minute or so, just summarizing, well, here's the key themes, here's what I've done in terms of introducing them, because some parts of your presentation might not be inherently obvious to everyone sitting there. And at the same time, you can use this as an opportunity to just hint at the value or the purpose of your research. So hypothetically, let's say you're looking at injuries in football. You could just briefly introduce what the most common injuries are and then hint at why this research is important. So, you know, time off that it costs players and the actual financial cost that it has for the team and the management. So you can just start to drip in the meaning and the implications of your research very early on. But again, not too long, very briefly, a minute or two, and then move on to the actual lit review side of what you're doing. Sorry, got a bit of a cough. So this is optional, but appropriate in some instances where you would include perhaps some early research. Now, the idea of your lit review is that you include studies that are recent, they're contemporary, because that is what would naturally guide your research. If you were doing a PhD, for example, you would spend an exhaustive amount of time reading more or less every paper in your area and seeing, okay, what's everyone else done? What haven't they done? Okay, I'll do that. Now, we're not expecting you to go that far, but we are expecting you to present several studies that are very recent, very contemporary, and have informed what you actually have gone on to do. But in some instances, there may be what we would call a seminal study, what was a groundbreaking study, you could say, which kicked off this area of research, and you might want to include that. Again, no more than a slide, because the idea is not for you to spend too much time on very old, dated research, so anything that's older than, say, 5-10 years maximum, really. But if there are one or two studies that you think, well, these are pretty key, these are what started this off, and I'd like to drop this in, then by all means, that's fine. But don't spend too many slides and dedicate too much of your time talking about these. It's optional, you don't have to do this. If you think, actually, no, there's nothing, I'd just rather start off with the most recent research, that's absolutely fine. But this can sometimes provide a nice bit of background information. Then you'll want to move on to your key studies. Generally speaking, the time will fly by for you. You'll be amazed how quickly this assessment will pass. And so you don't have a lot of time to discuss many studies. So I would recommend finding somewhere between 3 to 5 really key recent studies within your field that you think, yeah, these are studies that inform my area of research, and discussing those. I'll show you how to present them in a moment, but just for now, so you can present one per slide or two across a slide perhaps. Again, we'll come to that in a moment. But really the purpose of these slides where you're talking about your key studies is to address the question, what do we currently know about this topic? And at the same time, you're trying to provide a lead in to why your research therefore is an obvious continuation to what we currently know and how this has guided your research. I know you've chosen a topic, you haven't designed it for yourself, but it's still an appropriate thing to do. So this will take as many slides as is needed. Realistically, you'll probably want to include nearer 5 than 3. The idea being you don't need to go into excessive amounts of detail on the actual methodology used in these studies. You can hint at it, you can just say, well, this was a randomized control trial that used male participants, and just briefly surmise it as perhaps you would see in an abstract. You can go into that level of detail, but I wouldn't recommend going any further than that. What we want you to do is explain the findings and discuss them. What do they mean? Why are they important? How has this led you to where your research is going to go and what you hope to find? Don't spend too much time discussing what everyone did in this particular key study that you've found, if that makes sense. So this will be 3, 4, 5 slides, however many. And you will want to close with a method slide. Essentially, you've presented your key studies, or actually, sorry, I'll go back further than that. You've introduced your topic, you've presented some key studies, maybe with 1 or 2 early ones, and you've then come on to your method slide, where you've said, okay, this is the topic that I choose to research, this is what we currently know about it, and now this is what I'm going to investigate. And at this point, you want to state your aim, your hypotheses, and give a very brief overview of your study design. I would personally recommend stating your aim and hypotheses. Um, Very much your aim. Your hypotheses, I suppose, is up to you whether you want to include or not, but most definitely you'll need to include your study aim. You can type it and put it on your slides, but really this is just something that you could state verbally. You don't really need to include it on a slide. But what is nice, and what Dr. Devereaux likes particularly, is to include a schema, a flow diagram of your study, which you may have seen examples of these in some of the reading that you've done, where someone or a particular paper will lay out their study design in the form of a flow diagram, and that's very useful for just conveying to your reader, here's what we did in a nice, straightforward, easy to digest way. And really, by the time you reach your conclusion, you should have explained, as it says here on the slide, what you're doing and why you're doing it, why it's important. And that's the important thing, is value of your research. And what we're really looking for is, do you know what you're doing and why you're doing it? And that's the most important thing to bear in mind. So if on this slide you just want to include something like a schema, that's absolutely fine. And you'll then have a final slide which you don't really need to discuss, but you can hint at and we will obviously read, which is your references. And in terms of how you actually present these, it's entirely up to you. In terms of actual referencing style, any image that you include from a published paper will need to be referenced, and then, as you would in a report, and then presented in a reference section at the end of the paper, at the end of your presentation, sorry. The referencing style, as I say, is up to you, and I mean that, but I would very strongly recommend using Harvard or Vancouver. If you use something like APA, then we've got a whole load of names up on the screen as well, which just clutter it. And I'm not just saying this because of my general disdain for APA referencing. It doesn't help with the overall presentation of your work on your slides. Okay, I hope that makes sense. And what we're going to move on to now is some do's and do not do's, mainly do not do's, certainly to begin with. So here's a nice example. Now this is a very busy slide straight away, but each slide or each image represents something that we really don't want to see too much of. First and foremost, well, it's up to you. You could, if you want to challenge yourself here, you could pause at this point and see if you can guess everything on here that we wouldn't want to see, and then we'll see if that adds up. Up to you. But first and foremost, if we start in the top left-hand corner, I've snipped this image. None of these images relate to each other either. I've just picked them at random. This image has no explanation underneath it, so you see in the image next to it, even though that's fuzzy, there is an explanation of what's going on. You need to include that, and also it's been cropped, or in my case snipped, with another image next to it, which just looks lazy. It looks like it's been rushed. It looks like it's been done very quickly, which maybe it had, and it just doesn't look professional and neat, because you've got image A of a concentric protocol, torque, angle, concentric, eccentric, and part of image B next to it. It looks rubbish, doesn't it? The image next to that, to the right, the bar graph, it's fuzzy. We see this all the time. It's not a big deal, but it's so easy to get a nice quality, easy image. Snipping tool, as I've recommended to most of you, I'm sure by now, it is so easy to use, and this image would have been absolutely fine. It's a nice straightforward bar graph, but it's fuzzy. It's obviously not been snipped or copied at an appropriate time, and therefore it's come out rather grainy and it's hard to read. There's been many a time where we've sat there assessing a lit review presentation, not really being able to see what it is you're talking about. And what's worse is if you're relying on your slides to indicate to you what you need to do, it's not going to be good if you can't see it. So something to bear in mind is the clarity of the image, and what I've used in the bottom right hand corner is an example of one that has been copied clearly. So what you don't want is top middle, what you do want is bottom right. The image on the top right hand side of the slide, this can be a catch-22 because this is a big table with a lot of information on it, which is boring as heck to look at, and it's boring for you and it's boring for us. But in some papers, and they may be really crucial, really important papers, that's how they've presented their work. Now, in the past, I've occasionally recommended to students, have a go at presenting this in your own way. Try and put this information in a way that just makes it a bit more interesting and a bit more digestible. And then you can say that this was adapted from so and so and so and so, et al. 2000 and whatever. Or try to snip only the part of it that you are interested in. So maybe you just wanted to talk about the top few rows of information, but you're not going to talk about the bottom rows. Well, don't include them because it's not important, and try to highlight them in some way. But if you're only going to talk about one small portion of this table and you present the whole thing, it's just a bit boring and hard to read, and we're going to struggle to read it and pay attention to it. So try to find a way to make that a bit more digestible. Okay, Ronnie Coleman there in the bottom left, sorry, good. The bottom left-hand side. There's no harm in including one or two non-scientific images, just to keep your presentation interesting and just to make it engaging and to show a little bit of creativity. You obviously don't need to reference these, but don't go overboard. Okay, don't have some random image on every slide to try and make it fun, because it can really damage the quality of your work if you go overboard with this sort of thing. Try and present your work in a way that is conveying the image, conveying the information that you want to present to your audience in an effective way, in an original way, and an engaging way. But ultimately, remember that your PowerPoint slides are just supporting what you're saying. They are not supplementing what you're saying. The majority of your grade for this assessment will go on what is said by you, not what is presented on your PowerPoint slides. So being too quirky, too funny, and including too many just casual random images like this can be detrimental. Now, as an example of what to do, or more so what to do, I've prepared this slide here. Now, again, it's just black and white. I've been very unoriginal with the text. The software that I'm using to record this video has cropped out the references that I've included, so that's a shame, I've just noticed. But it's slightly better. So 1 or 2 images per slide is useful. The images are evenly proportioned, so you haven't got one huge image and one that's small at the side that you can't really see. The descriptor of the image, providing it's not too long, is also included in there, so that's useful. And everything's nicely proportioned. Now, I wouldn't always recommend presenting in this style with just black and white, although some institutions like this, but you can do something a bit more creative. That's fine. If you want to use a particular background, that's okay, just nothing too silly, really. But images are what we want to see. Very little text, minimal text. We don't want slides that are just blocks and blocks of writing, because we're not going to read and listen to you at the same time. It's impossible. And we don't expect you to just be reading off a slide. We expect to see images like this. Now, these two studies don't relate to each other, but I've just chosen them at random. But hypothetically, if you have 2 studies, I don't know, one that has slightly conflicting results to the other, then that's great. You can say, well, study A found this, study B found this, and and talk about that in some level of detail. Be sure to reference the images that you use if they've come from a scientific source, which most of them should have. Again, I have done, but what I'm using to record this is just crop those off, which is a shame. Make sure you have a title at the top and be consistent in your presentation style. I.e., in my case, the title's in the top left-hand corner. Keep it in the top left-hand corner as often as you can. Make sure the images are central in the slide, and try and make sure that the clarity is as good as you can get it. So just a few final do's and don'ts. Practice. I can't emphasize this enough. We can instantly tell who has and hasn't practiced. I would say practice at least 5 or 10 times before you come in to actually do your assessment. And again, this doesn't have to be a full run through from beginning to end. This can just be, well, I'll practice a couple of slides now, and I'll do another couple of slides in half an hour, and so on. So it doesn't have to become more laborious. Practice in the car, maybe when you're driving along a bit bored. Try to practice in front of an audience if you can. Friends and family, dogs, cats, mice, whatever. Stand in the mirror, present to yourself. Honestly, the more you practice, the better you'll do. I can't emphasize this enough. Certainly, once you've gathered all your information, put your slides together, chosen the information that you think is important that you want to talk about. Once you've got everything else together and you know what you want to say and how you're going to present it, you need to work on your actual presentation style. And that's so important. That should make up the bulk of your revision. The other point is do lots of reading. Find out as much as you can about your chosen topic. Don't scrimp on this. Don't just think, well, I'll pick the first 4 that come along, because we know these topics. I know the topic that you're going to present. So make some effort here with this. Start with a literature review maybe, but don't just rely on one article. Even if it is a current literature review, try and find something that's as contemporary as you can, and make sure you do lots of reading. Even if you just read one paper a day, or you don't even have to read the whole paper. In some cases, you can get away with reading the abstract. Make sure you do as much reading as possible, because the more you read, the more you know, and the more confident you'll be. As I've said before, don't spend too much time on your slides. That's not where the majority of your marks are going to go. And keep the text on your slides to a minimum, because we want to see images. Your slides, as we've said, should support what you're saying. They shouldn't replicate it. Finally, use of notes and things of that nature. I would not advise you coming in with a script, because if you read a script as you present, or read off a script, I should say, you're demonstrating that you can read, not that you understand your topic. So that's not going to go in your favor. Prompt cards, I would say, is a maximum of what you can possibly use. But at the same time, if you can just come in and say it from the top of your head without using any prompts, that's all the better. That's going to work all the more in your favor. And help yourself out. Put things on your PowerPoint slides that you think, actually, I can use this. This is going to work really well. That's what I do during my lectures. I'm sure I've mentioned this before. I can't remember the order of every single presentation that I give, so I will put information on there that I think that will remind me of what's coming next. So use that to your advantage. But most definitely don't just come in and read off a script, because that will not work in your favor at all.